On an ordinary city bus, one moment changed the entire ride for everyone on board. What happened? You'll find out at the end. Watch closely and comment which city you're watching from. Subscribe and leave a like. The late morning light drifted over Seattle like a soft veil, warming the glass of office towers and glinting off the rippling surface of Elliott Bay. The city breathed in its familiar rhythm, buses sighing at stops, pedestrians crossing streets with practiced impatience, and the hum of traffic blending into the living pulse of the day. At a quiet bus stop near Pine Street, a man stood among the scattered commuters, his presence unremarkable to anyone who didn't know how to look deeper. He wore a black jacket, dark jeans, and boots scuffed not from neglect, but from years of steady use. His posture was straight yet relaxed, the kind of balance that only comes from discipline and years of controlled physical movement. His face carried no arrogance, no invitation for conversation, only calm neutrality. His name was Steven Seagal, not the actor, not a public figure of any kind, but a man who had spent a lifetime learning how to move without disturbing the air around him. Seattle was a city that swallowed people whole with its pace, and he welcomed the anonymity it offered him. To the others waiting, he was simply another commuter with somewhere to be. Steven checked the time on his watch, but without urgency. He had left early on purpose, allowing space for delays, crowds, or the subtle unpredictability of the city. Today mattered. Today he was traveling not for work, not for errands, but to attend a ceremony honoring a woman who had shaped his life decades earlier. Her name was Mrs. Hamilton, a retired teacher and community volunteer whose impact had rarely been acknowledged beyond the small circles of people she had quietly helped. Years ago, when Steven had been a young instructor unsure of his place in the world, she had guided him with a simple truth. Strength means nothing if it is not used to protect others. It was a lesson that had followed him through every stage of his adult life, woven into his movement, his choices, and the quiet discipline that defined him. Today she would be honored at the community service hall on the east side of the city, and he intended to be there, not as a guest seeking recognition, but as someone whose life had been quietly redirected by her kindness. The bus approached with a rush of warm, diesel-scented air and a hiss of brakes. Steven stepped inside, tapped his fare card, and walked down the aisle with deliberate ease. He chose a window seat halfway down, resting an arm on the metal bar and allowing his gaze to drift without ever settling too long on anyone. The bus interior was familiar, the slightly worn fabric of the seats, the faint smell of cleaning solution, and the rattling window frames that responded to every bump in the road. People filled the seats around him, embodying the city's mosaic. A stressed office worker in a wrinkled shirt tapped rapidly on his phone, muttering under his breath as if his thumbs could chase away a deadline. A college student with headphones sketched in a notebook, lines flowing effortlessly from pencil to paper. A mother balanced her energetic toddler on her lap while trying to adjust shopping bags at her feet. Near the back, a construction worker leaned against the window, eyes already slipping closed in exhaustion. Steven watched without judgment. Observation had been part of his nature since youth, reading body language, sensing tension, noticing the small patterns that others overlooked. It wasn't suspicion. It was a way of understanding people, recognizing the invisible stories in their shoulders, their voices, their attempts to hold themselves together. The bus rocked forward again, easing into traffic with the slow determination of public transportation. Steven felt the movement, but didn't resist it. He let it settle through him like a breath. He hadn't come here to intervene in anyone's day or to stand out. He simply needed to reach his destination, and the bus was the simplest, most unremarkable way to get there. For several minutes, the ride remained peaceful. Conversations murmured softly. The city outside unfolded in glimpses, cafes with morning lines, storefronts with dusty signs, patches of sunlight breaking through clouds. Steven adjusted his sleeve, feeling the weight of the day ahead. He did not anticipate trouble. He did not anticipate becoming part of anything other than the steady flow of commuters moving from one place to another. Yet he knew, in a quiet, instinctive way, that life rarely allowed a person to move unnoticed for long. On a bus filled with strangers, small decisions could ripple outward into moments that defined entire days. And the moment that would change the quiet rhythm of this ride was approaching the bus stop now, step by slow step, without anyone yet realizing it. When the bus slowed for the next stop, the doors opened with a familiar groan. Steven lifted his eyes almost unconsciously, not expecting anything unusual, simply acknowledging the movement of people boarding and leaving. But then he saw her. An elderly woman stood at the curb, holding 2 heavy grocery bags and a worn leather purse pressed close to her chest. Her hair was silver, pinned neatly in place, shimmering faintly in the sunlight. Her steps were deliberate, careful, as though each one cost her more than she let on. Her breathing was shallow, her shoulders tense under the weight she carried, yet she approached the bus with the quiet dignity of someone who had never allowed age to diminish her sense of purpose. The driver waited patiently as she climbed the steps, giving her the extra seconds she needed. That alone told Steven something. People like her inspired respect, even in hurried cities. As she stepped into the aisle, the atmosphere inside shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. Some passengers glanced up, others pretended not to see. She walked slowly, scanning the seats for a place to rest. Her eyes found the one open seat available. At least it should have been available. But a young man sat there, sprawled across 2 seats, his legs stretched out to claim space that was never meant for him. His headphones thumped with heavy bass, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Brand logos gleamed across his jacket, his shoes, even his smartwatch. His posture radiated a practiced carelessness, the kind that comes from believing the world exists to cushion your comfort. The elderly woman paused beside him, her knuckles tightening around the grocery bags. She waited silently, hoping he would notice her, hoping the world still remembered what kindness looked like. Steven saw the moment stretch too long, painfully long, and though he did not move, something within him shifted. The bus rolled forward again, and the woman gripped the nearest pole to keep her balance, the strain visible in her trembling fingers. Steven exhaled softly, sensing the beginning of something he had not sought, but could no longer ignore. The day had taken a turn. The quiet ride was over. The story had begun. The bus continued its steady movement through the streets of Seattle as the elderly woman clung to the pole, her chest rising and falling in shallow, effortful breaths. The weight of her grocery bag strained her thin arms, and although she tried to hide it, every small tremor in her hands revealed how badly she needed to sit down. Her eyes drifted once more toward the seat that should have been hers, the seat still occupied not by a person but by the outstretched legs of a young man drowning in his own music. His expensive sneakers pressed into the fabric, creasing it casually, as though the entire row belonged to him alone. He hadn't looked up once, not when she entered, not when she stood beside him, not when she asked softly, almost shyly, if she could sit. The music booming in his ears created the illusion of a world where no one existed but him. Some passengers glanced at the scene with discomfort. A teenage girl paused her music, stealing a quick look before pretending to scroll her phone again. A middle-aged man in a business suit lowered his newspaper just long enough to assess the situation, then shifted uncomfortably. A young mother pulled her child closer, as if shielding him from the tension creeping through the aisle. The medic seated across from the elderly woman began to watch more closely, her brow tightening with concern. The air on the bus grew heavier, not because of noise, but because of the silence that followed the woman's unmet plea. The bus jerked slightly as it moved over a rough patch in the road, and the woman's grip faltered for a moment. One of her bags bumped against her leg, making her wince. Steven observed all of this without moving, though the stillness inside him was beginning to form a sharper edge. He could read the atmosphere the same way he read body language. There was hesitation, guilt, frustration, and yet no one was stepping forward. Not out of cruelty, but out of the quiet, common fear of confrontation. Strength was rare in places where social pressure outweighed moral instinct. The woman gathered her courage and tried again. "Young man, could I please sit?" Her voice was soft, fragile, trembling, not with anger, but with fatigue. This time, the boy heard her. He removed one earbud with an exaggerated sigh and turned his head just enough to acknowledge her presence. His eyes flicked up and down her face in a single dismissive sweep. He smirked. Then he raised the volume on his music and leaned back even farther, his legs unmoving. It was a refusal so deliberate, it sent a visible ripple of discomfort through the bus. The medic stood quickly and moved to the woman's side, placing a gentle hand on her elbow. "Ma'am, are you all right? You look pale. Let's find you a seat." The elderly woman forced a small smile as if to reassure her. "I'll be fine. Just a little tired." But the medic wasn't convinced. Her protective instincts sharpened as she glanced around the bus. She saw the man in the suit watching. She saw the teenager pretending not to notice. She saw the mother clutching her child a little tighter. And she saw the young man, whose feet still occupied the seat, whose entitlement radiated like a shield he believed no one would challenge. "Sir," she said, her voice firmer now, "please move your feet so she can sit." The young man didn't bother to look at her. "Paid my fare," he muttered loudly enough for several rows to hear. "Not my job to babysit the elderly. I'm comfortable." That was the moment when the murmur in the bus shifted. People exchanged looks, shock, irritation, disbelief. The man in the suit leaned forward. "Young man, show some respect. Let the woman sit." The boy finally looked up, irritation flashing across his expression, as if the entire world had conspired to inconvenience him. "I paid for my seat," he said louder. "Both seats if I want. My dad pays more taxes in a week than any of you do in a year. So don't start preaching." The tone of his voice, the pride dripping from every word, struck the passengers like a slap. His arrogance didn't just fill the air, it sucked all the air out of it. The bus driver glanced in the rearview mirror, saw the emerging conflict, and immediately looked away. Paperwork, complaints, corporate escalation. He didn't want any part of it. The medic took a deeper breath, her frustration now clear. "Sir," she said, leaning slightly toward the boy. "This woman is close to fainting. She needs to sit immediately." That got him to move, but not in the way anyone hoped. He pulled out his phone, showing a picture of himself standing beside an older man in a tailored suit outside a luxury office building. "You see this?" he said proudly. "That's my dad. If he finds out any of you tried to tell me what to do, this whole bus line is going to hear about it. So back off." The medic stared at him, stunned by the brazenness of his threat. The woman's knees buckled suddenly, and the medic caught her just before she fell. Gasps echoed through the bus. The medic raised her voice now, no longer polite. "She needs to sit. Move your feet. Now." The boy laughed, a short, cruel sound. "Not my problem. If she can't stand, she shouldn't be on a bus." The phrase lingered in the air like a stain. Steven felt the shift inside himself, the way a fighter senses an oncoming strike, not with fear, but with clarity. This was the moment the bus had been tumbling toward, the moment that separated discomfort from injustice, the moment when someone needed to move. The woman's face had drained of color. Her breathing grew shallow. The medic held her with both arms. The passengers froze, caught between their frustration and their fear. Steven had seen enough. He stood slowly, placing one hand on the seat in front of him as he rose. His movements were precise, silent, controlled, as though he had spent a lifetime learning not only how to move, but why to move. He didn't rush, he didn't speak, but the change in the aisle was unmistakable. A presence had entered the conflict, not loud, not aggressive, but steady enough that people straightened unconsciously. The man in the suit held his breath. The teenager stopped pretending to look at her phone. The mother hugged her child closer. The medic looked relieved, though she didn't yet know why. The only person who didn't notice was the young man sprawled across the seats, but he was about to. Steven stepped into the aisle, and the atmosphere tightened around him like air before thunder. He walked forward with the calm certainty of someone for whom confrontation was neither frightening nor desirable, only necessary. The elderly woman, still trembling, lifted her eyes toward him with surprise, though she recognized nothing yet. The bus rocked gently as Steven came to a stop beside the young man, casting a shadow that stretched across the boy's glowing phone screen. That was when the teenage passenger finally looked up, bewildered by the sudden silence. The boy pulled out his other earbud and turned with annoyance, his smirk already forming like a shield. "What? What do you want?" His voice sliced into the quiet space. The passengers braced, holding their breath, sensing the moment resting on a fragile thread. Steven looked at him, not with anger, not with judgment, but with the calm of a man who had learned long ago that real strength never needed to raise its voice. The tension inside the bus, simmering for minutes, had finally reached the point where it could no longer hide. The conflict had begun. The young man stared at Steven with a mix of irritation and manufactured boldness, the kind of bravado built on a lifetime of believing he was untouchable. His smirk widened, as if he expected his glare to make this stranger step back. "What are you staring at, old man? You gonna give me a speech too?" His voice carried through the bus like a challenge thrown into quiet water. But Steven did not react. He did not flinch, did not shift, did not show even the smallest sign of agitation. He simply stood there, his presence steady as a stone in a river. The passengers felt it before they understood it, the subtle tightening of space, the way the air seemed to curve around him instead of passing through him. The young man was still performing. Steven was simply existing. "Move your feet," Steven said with a quietness that did not diminish its authority. It was not a request. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, shaped by years of learning how to say the exact number of words necessary. The boy scoffed loudly, trying to regain his fading sense of control. "Why? You gonna make me?" His voice cracked slightly, though he covered it by leaning back with forced relaxation, his arms crossed over his chest. "I paid for this seat. Both seats if I want to. If she can't stand, that's her problem. I'm not moving just because some old lady can't handle a bus ride." The medic gasped, fury rising behind her restraint, but she said nothing now. The moment had shifted out of her hands. Steven lowered his gaze just enough to acknowledge the trembling elderly woman struggling to remain upright. Then he looked at the boy again. "You heard her ask," he said simply. "You ignored her. Now she needs help, and you're still choosing to ignore her." The young man stiffened. Something inside him flickered confusion, maybe unease, but he smothered it beneath arrogance. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't know who I am." He held up his phone again, tapping the cracked screen where the picture of him with his wealthy father glowed beneath shattered glass. "This is influence. My father could buy this whole bus line. He could ruin your entire life with one phone call. So unless you want things to get ugly, step back." The passengers shifted uneasily. They had heard people like this before. Boys raised to believe their father's power belonged to them as well. Steven didn't look at the phone. He didn't react to the threat. "Your father isn't here," he replied. The boy blinked, annoyed by the simplicity of the answer, as if he had expected a more dramatic reaction. The bus hit another bump, and the elderly woman swayed dangerously, her bags shaking in the medic's hands. "Enough," the medic said sharply. "She needs to sit down right now. Move your feet." But the boy only rolled his eyes. If she can't handle public transit, she should stay home. The sentence rang across the bus like a hammer blow. The man in the suit groaned under his breath. The teenager closed her sketchbook, sensing something irreversible about to happen. The mother pulled her child close, whispering a soft reassurance. The construction worker opened his eyes fully now, as if waking from a long nap into a problem he wished he didn't recognize. That was the moment the boy decided he needed to regain control. He stood abruptly, puffing out his chest, as if preparing for a confrontation he believed he would win. His chin lifted, his fists curled, and he glared at Steven with all the fury of someone who had never once been told no. "You don't get to talk to me like that. You don't tell me what to do. And just so you understand," he stepped closer, shoving Steven hard in the center of the chest. The shove came fast, powered not by training, but by entitlement, and the assumption that force alone could demand respect. The passengers gasped. The medic tensed. The elderly woman's eyes widened with fear. But Steven didn't move. The boy's hand pressed against him like a wave striking a rock, loud, sudden, and utterly ineffective. He expected Steven to stumble back, to react, to break his stillness. Instead, Steven looked down at the boy's hand, then met his eyes again. "Are you done?" he asked. The boy's confidence faltered for the first time. His eyes darted around the bus, searching for validation, for support, for anything to confirm that he still held the upper hand. But no one spoke. No one nodded. No one backed him. The silence that had once protected him now cornered him. He shoved again, harder this time, desperation twisting his face. Steven stepped aside with a single fluid movement, redirecting the boy's momentum the way a river redirects a fallen branch. The boy stumbled forward, thrown by his own force rather than Steven's strength. Before he could fall, Steven's hand guided his arm lightly but decisively, turning the stumble into a downward movement that ended with the boy on one knee between the seats, disarmed not by violence, but by technique. It happened so quickly, so gracefully, that the passengers could barely follow the path of motion. What did you—" the boy sputtered, trying to push himself up. Steven placed 2 fingers on the boy's wrist, applying the smallest amount of controlled pressure. The boy froze instantly, pain radiating just enough to make movement unwise. "Sit," Steven said. His tone was the same as before, calm, steady, final. The boy sank back onto the edge of the seat, his breath shaking. His anger was still there, burning behind his eyes. But something else had joined it now. Fear, or perhaps understanding. Steven released him and turned away, no longer interested in the boy's reaction. He approached the elderly woman with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the confrontation that had just ended. "May I help you sit?" he asked softly. She nodded, her voice too faint for words. Steven guided her to the seat, steadying her as she lowered herself, careful not to jostle her tired limbs. The medic adjusted the grocery bags beside her, checking her pulse again. The color in the woman's cheeks began to return slowly, like dawn pushing through fog. Around them, the passengers exhaled for the first time in several minutes. Some applauded quietly, others simply looked away, ashamed by how long they had remained silent. The man in the suit nodded at Steven with deep respect. The teenager stared at him with wide eyes, sketchbook forgotten. The mother whispered something to her child about kindness. The construction worker let out a long breath, the kind that releases an entire day's frustration. The young man on the seat stared at his broken phone. The blinking red light of the bus's security camera reflected in its fractured surface. He realized perhaps for the first time in his life, that the world would not bend for him simply because he demanded it. His father's power could not erase the truth captured above him. His arrogance had not saved him. His threats had fallen hollow. And the man he had tried to intimidate had dismantled his bravado without throwing a single punch. The bus rolled onward, the conflict fading, but the lesson remaining, etched into every face in the aisle. Steven returned to his seat with the same calm he had carried from the beginning, but the atmosphere around him had changed entirely. The ride was no longer ordinary. It had become something else, something that would leave everyone on the bus a little different than they had been when they boarded. The quiet continued, but now it carried respect rather than fear. And although Steven did not look around to see their reactions, the passengers knew instinctively that the moment of confrontation had passed, but the story was not yet finished. The bus continued toward its final destination with a quietness that felt heavier than silence, shaped not by fear, but by the weight of everything that had happened. The young man sat motionless now, clutching his cracked phone with trembling fingers, no longer hiding behind arrogance or loud music. The red light of the security camera glowed above him like a small, unblinking witness. Every threat he had made felt suddenly hollow. Every word he had spoken replayed in his mind with crushing clarity. For the first time in his life, he was left alone with the reality of his actions, stripped of the shield that his father's influence had always provided him. The passengers around him no longer stared in anger. They stared in disappointment, a gaze far more punishing than any confrontation. At the front of the bus, the driver cleared his throat and turned on the intercom. Next stop, Community Service Hall. Passengers heading to the event, please prepare to exit. His tone was gentler than before, touched by a reverence that had not been present at the start of the ride. Through the windows, the building came into view, a wide plaza filled with folding chairs, a banner stretched across its entrance, people gathering in small clusters, some carrying programs, others adjusting displays of framed photographs and medals. Flowers lined the walkway, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. The medic helped the elderly woman stand, supporting her elbow as she rose. Her breathing was steadier now, though her legs trembled with the remnants of exhaustion. As she stepped toward the exit, a volunteer wearing a blue badge hurried up the bus stairs, his expression shifting from concern to relief when he saw her. "Mrs. Hamilton, thank God you're here. Everyone has been waiting. You gave us a scare." The passengers looked at one another in surprise. "Mrs. Hamilton!" A name that suddenly carried weight. Respect radiated from the volunteer's voice, a stark contrast to how she had been treated minutes earlier by someone who had never bothered to ask her name. The medic handed off the grocery bags to another volunteer, and together they guided the woman onto the plaza. As soon as she stepped outside, the small crowd turned, their faces lighting with recognition. Applause spread across the gathering, not thunderous, but warm, sincere, heartfelt. People approached her with gratitude in their eyes. She nodded to each of them, humbled by the attention, grateful but overwhelmed. Passengers from the bus leaned closer to the windows, astonished, as the humble woman they had silently watched was greeted like an honored guest. Steven stood now, moving quietly toward the exit. The volunteer at the bus door straightened when he recognized him. "Mr. Seagal, you made it right on time." Steven offered a small nod of acknowledgement, stepping out of the bus without ceremony. He didn't look back at the passengers, nor did he seek recognition from the crowd. He simply followed the volunteers toward the entrance where the ceremony would begin. The applause that had welcomed Mrs. Hamilton embraced him too, but he received it with the same calm dignity he carried everywhere, accepting, but never basking. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was solemn yet warm. Rows of chairs faced a small stage, decorated with photographs from decades of community service school events, charity drives, youth mentorship programs, veteran support efforts. One picture showed a young instructor teaching self-defense to at-risk teens, guided by a woman whose posture was unmistakable even in her youth. Mrs. Hamilton had been teaching compassion long before anyone had thought to honor her for it. Steven took a place along the side wall, standing quietly as people approached the podium. The speaker began with stories of her life, how she had dedicated years to teaching children who had no one else to guide them, how she had volunteered through city crisis programs, how she had carried forward her late husband's charity work after his passing, never seeking praise, never accepting payment. She had changed lives quietly, steadily, one act of kindness at a time. Steven listened with a bowed head, remembering the day she had changed his. He had been young, uncertain, discouraged. She had placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Strength isn't about being feared. Strength is about choosing who you rise to protect." Those words had carried him through decades. As the applause grew around her, Mrs. Hamilton looked toward Steven. Her eyes softened with recognition, a memory shared only between teacher and student. She approached him after the ceremony, her steps slow but purposeful, and placed her hand in his. "You always knew the difference," she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, between fighting and protecting. Steven's expression warmed into a rare, gentle smile. "I only practiced what you taught me," he replied. For a moment, the world around them faded, replaced by the quiet truth of what she had meant to him. Meanwhile, the bus reached its terminal stop. Transit security waited by the platform, calm, professional, their presence not shaped by punishment, but by procedure. They boarded the bus with measured steps and approached the young man who had once sat like a king of his own imagined world. He tried to speak, to explain, to excuse, to twist the story into something safer, but the words tangled in his throat. The officers did not raise their voices or touch him roughly. They simply asked him to come with them so they could review the incident, captured by the cameras. The boy stood, his face pale, his hands shaking. Passengers stepped aside without a word, giving him space not out of respect, but out of quiet judgment. The bus emptied, and the ride that had begun as ordinary ended with a lesson carved into the memory of every soul inside it. Not with violence, not with revenge, but with consequence, the kind that lingers long after the moment is over. Back at the community center, the ceremony concluded. People mingled in small groups, sharing stories of how Mrs. Hamilton had changed their lives. Steven slipped toward the doors without drawing attention, stepping outside into the warm glow of late afternoon. The volunteers were gathering chairs, folding banners, cleaning up after the event. He watched them for a moment, appreciating the simple beauty of people working together for someone who had earned their respect. At the bus stop just beyond the plaza, another bus pulled up. A teenage boy with a backpack stepped aside to let an elderly man board first. When the older passenger hesitated, the teenager immediately offered his seat. No cameras recorded it. No applause followed. It was a small gesture. Quiet. Ordinary. But Steven saw it. And he understood that good spreads the same way harm does quietly, from one person to another, until it becomes something larger than any single moment. He adjusted his jacket, took a slow breath, and walked down the sidewalk, not as a hero or a legend, but as a man continuing a journey that had begun long before today. He carried with him the same truth that had guided him for years. Real influence didn't demand respect, it earned it, and passed it forward, one choice at a time. Behind him, the plaza buzzed with life, the city carried on, and somewhere in the echo of applause and silence, a lesson took root in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. The story had found its end, not with noise, but with understanding. Thank you for watching. Comment where you're watching from, and what you would have done in that situation. Subscribe and leave a like. More stories are coming.